So thanks for tuning in today. I'm Carrie Ann Wright-Cato, Director of the Office of Climate Change, Technology and Research at Connecticut DEEP. Welcome to the Exploring Climate Solutions webinar series. The series is brought to you by the Governor's Council on Climate Change. On April 22nd, 2015, Governor Malloy issued an executive order creating the Governor's Council on Climate Change, also known as the GC3. The Council is charged with examining the efficacy of existing policies and regulations designed to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and identify new strategies to meet the state's greenhouse gas emission reduction targets. The Council is composed of 15 members from state agencies, quasi-state agencies, businesses, and nonprofits. To learn more about the GC3, please go to www.ct.gov/DEEP/GC3. The webinar series explores innovative and successful climate solutions in Connecticut and around the nation. The series provides a firsthand account of high-profile municipal climate programs, climate initiatives in the corporate world, new greenhouse gas reporting frameworks, statewide sustainability programs, low-carbon fuel initiatives, and other programs and projects that help reduce greenhouse gas emissions and improve climate resilience. So today, we're really excited to have Dr. Chaley Hoover, a research ecologist at the U.S. Forest Service. Dr. Hoover will be telling us about a number of tools relating to forest carbon estimation. These products cover a range of spatial scales from individual forest stands to the continental U.S. and vary in the amount of data and training required, which she will cover for us. The webinars will also cover important considerations when choosing a tool and introduce the tools with the national level coverage. So with that, a few tips on submitting questions. If you do have a question, submit them in your dialog box. You should have a chat function or a question function. Either is fine. I will read them aloud after the presentation is done for Chaley to respond to. I also want to give the tip if you're listening to the webinar via your computer speakers and you're having a little spotty being able to hear us talk, I do recommend that you call in directly from a landline or possibly a cell phone. So with that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Chaley and get us started. Thanks again so much for presenting.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to share this lunch hour with you. Hopefully there'll be some things you can use in your work. So I always like to say that I was doing forest carbon before carbon was cool, which is true. I actually started in 1999, and when I would give talks, people would be like, well, that's kind of weird. And so it's really interesting and fun for me to see how mainstream this has become. So a lot of what I do is look at forest carbon estimation and management at the stand and landscape scale. And in particular, I spend a lot of time looking at the carbon consequences of common silvicultural practices. So that's a lot of what I do. I do enjoy doing training sessions. I do a lot of forest carbon 101 for folks to kind of get them up to speed because it can be kind of overwhelming when you get started. So with that, a little outline here. So the foundation, just briefly the foundation of the tools, and then I'm going to introduce some selected tools. There are a ton of tools out there. There are new tools coming online from all different sources. So we're just going to cover a small subset and then sort of the pros and cons, benefits and limitations of each of them, and then spend some time talking about how you choose the right tool for the right job. Because if you go looking, again, you're going to find an awful lot of things. And so what are sort of some things to keep in mind when you are shopping, as it were, for a tool, and then where to find these tools and additional information. So a little bit about the background. Most of the Forest Service tools are based on forest inventory data from the Forest Inventory and Analysis Program, also known as FIA, and a lot of you are probably familiar with FIA. You've probably seen the state level reports. A lot of these tools are periodically updated. Sometimes, as in the case of FIA, data collection is ongoing. There might be changes to the computation methods as new information becomes available, that sort of thing. None of the tools I'm going to talk about today provide what's called a life cycle analysis, which is cradle to grave. So it would be all of the carbon inherent in producing, transporting, manufacturing something. And usually you might see that in terms of harvested wood products. There are tools that do that. The one I'm most aware of is called Corim, but none of these tools do that. They simply report forest carbon pools or fluxes. So I'm going to talk a fair bit about, I'll keep coming back to scale because it's a really important consideration, and when you're just getting involved, it can be an easy thing to get a little bit hung up on, but it is really important. So the tools I'm going to talk about today have output at a range of scales, so anywhere from a forest stand all the way up to a national level. And all of these tools, except the Forest Vegetation Simulator, are based on that forest inventory and analysis data. So with that, just a little overview about FIA. And again, I suspect a lot of you have at least peeked at one of the statewide reports that come out periodically for each state. There are national reports too that kind of cover a range of information about the forest resources in the United States, and then again, statewide reports, and sometimes there are specialized reports. But there's a whole universe of other products out there too, and it all rests on this national sampling program. So off to the right of the screen, you see a little diagram. It is a cluster plot, so it's 4 little subplots. And most of what we use is what's called phase 2. This is your basic forest inventory. So this is the scale thing. There's about 1 plot for every 6,000 acres. This is designed to meet, it's a national inventory designed to meet statewide accuracy targets. And that will become important later. In the east, every plot is visited every 5-ish years, and that's 10 or so in the west. In the past, crews would come into a state, they'd inventory the whole state at once, and then they wouldn't come back for 10 or 15 years. Now, a subset of plots is measured in every state every year, and then the database is continually updated. Phase 3 is the forest health portion. You might be less familiar with this. Far fewer, so 1 out of every 16 is one of these special plots. Measure a whole lot of other attributes, including soils, forest floor, and down dead wood. So this actually comes out to 1 plot for about every 96,000 acres, so far more sparse. And this is where scale will factor in. But where you can find these, if you haven't ever looked for FIA data, haven't known where to find it or thought maybe you needed it, carbon is now part of the FIA database. So along with all of your regular attributes, such as merchantable volume or basal area, you can also find estimates for the carbon pools. So Datum is a new product, and this has 4 components, including basic tables of forest attributes. There's also a spatial component I haven't worked with yet, but that is a newer thing, and some other components to it. So this will actually accommodate a pretty wide variety of users. So you can just go and get some basic information without a lot of trouble, or you can get into some of the more sophisticated aspects of the tool. And this does come with estimates of error. eValidator is also, this is one I will most commonly use. This will give you estimates and sampling errors for areas that you choose. You might pick counties, you might pick states, several different varieties of methods to choose, and you can customize these tables so you can retrieve just the attributes you're interested in. It's easy to use, and the error is really important, and this will keep coming up because national program, statewide targets. When you're choosing smaller areas, remember there's 1 plot every 6,000 acres for the main tree attributes. So you can really get a sample that's not representative, and your error can increase. So it's important to pay attention to that. And then there's the Data Mart. A whole lot of things available there. The FIA database is a whole series of interlinked tables. There's a ginormous manual that spells it all out. So you can get all sorts of things out of that. It can get fairly complicated. So the Data Mart is more if you really want to get in the weeds. And then there's a lot of other products that are also available. And you can find it at this website, or if you just Google Forest Inventory and Analysis, it will get you there. And this is a recent screenshot. This is what that data and tools page looks like. And you can see Datum and eValidator, other reporting tools. There's a whole lot of goodies there as well. Some things regarding woodland owner surveys, wood product surveys, that sort of thing. So if you're looking for carbon data or just forest attribute data in general, this is a good place to go. And most of our tools tie back to this particular database. So with that, we're looking here at the White Mountain National Forest from the top of Mount Hedgehog, if anyone is wondering. We're going to finish with caveats, but I'm also going to start with caveats. I was talking to someone a few weeks ago from Forest Inventory and Analysis, and he was saying, you know, these are all estimates. It's not truth. And that's the important key. Anytime we're working with a sampling situation, we haven't measured the entire population, there's always errors. These are always estimates, and it's important to keep in mind, you know, there's this famous quote from George Box, all models are wrong, but some are useful. And this is really true. There are components in forest carbon that are modeled, like below ground biomass, so there's always error inherent in that. There's always sampling error. You know, we're talking about estimates with levels of error associated with it. So it's important to remember that, you know, the X-Files, the truth is out there. And the truth is out there, but mostly we are dealing with estimates, not the absolute truth. There is no one all-purpose tool or model. All we really want there to be. We really want there to be a magic model, a magic tool. We don't need a lot of data. It works everywhere, and it gives us answers that are absolutely accurate. I'm sorry. There isn't one. There's always trade-offs. And so it's important to keep them in mind when you're shopping to find the right tool for the job. So whether a model is empirical, which means it's based on data from a particular forest or series of forests, or it's process-based, where it's modeling, you know, a forest model that's process-based will model different physiological processes to model growth. There's always trade-offs. The biggest one we have is generality versus accuracy. And unfortunately, there's just no getting around it. If you have a model that works everywhere, it's probably not very accurate because it's trying to represent a really large area, say every forest in the East. If there's a model that's very accurate, it might be a growth and yield model or a process model. It was probably built on 1 or 2 or 3 particular forests. So it was built on data from those forests. And so it's very accurate. But if you take it 500 miles away, it might not be very accurate. It's also important to think about costs. Generally, the more money it takes to develop a model, the more accurate it will be. And data, we'll come back to data, but the data required are really important as well. If you don't have the right input data, you're not going to be able to use that model. The more data a model requires, the more accurate it likely is. No free lunches. This is another big one. I've started working some with LiDAR data, and a lot of people hope, oh, we'll do everything with remote sensing and we won't have to put boots on the ground because inventory, I mean, it's time consuming and expensive, but those are still models. You're still modeling, you're tying your remotely sensed variable to something on the ground, and surprise, in order to do that, you still need field data to develop those models and equations and validate them. And then of course, the more sophisticated a tool, the steeper the learning curve. So Sorry, there are no free lunches when we're talking about tools. Things to think about, and we'll come back to them in more detail. Spatial scale, the underlying data. Where was this tool built? What data set was it built on? Does that fit your area? Key assumptions. Are there particular assumptions that underpin the model or tool? And can you meet them? And then the data requirements. If you don't have the data to run a model, then that's simply not an option for you. So with that, we're going to start off with the simplest thing, and an oldie but a goodie. It's from 2006, GTR 343, also known rather technically as the Green Book. This was developed to support something called the 1605B program, which was a voluntary greenhouse gas reporting program that was run through the Department of Energy. That program is no longer in existence, but a lot of support work was done. So what this is really, there's some clear methods laid out and a book of tables of forest carbon for different forest types and regions in the US. And this has been very popular. If you don't have field data, it can be kind of a benchmark, kind of a ballpark estimate. It does include all the carbon pools. Many of those are now estimated differently by FIA, but this is still useful, and you can find it and download it online. I think we still have some in a box. I could send you your very own copy if you really wanted. This is used as a baseline by some programs as well. So what can GTR 343 do for you? It's a quick estimate. These are regional averages. It's a good reality check. You know, if you've gone and estimated your carbon for your forest and you wonder, oh, am I right? Does this make sense? It's a good place to go and check without having to use an FIA tool and invest that time. And these tables go through time. So they go from age 0 to either 85 or 125 years, depending on the region. So it can give you an idea of what those carbon increases might be. Again, regional averages, ballpark estimates. This doesn't substitute for inventory data if you were doing a particular project, because again, it's a regional average, not a definite projection. These are just estimates of what might occur over time. And there's no way to look at your outcomes of management actions when you're using these tables. But they have proven to be very useful for a lot of people. And I have a set. I frequently look at mine when I see a number and I want to say, does that number make sense? This is a tool I've used a lot. The Carbon Online Estimator. It was developed in partnership with the National Council on Air and Stream Improvement and the Forest Service. It does work with the FIA database. The last update was in 2016. I don't know if this tool is being actively maintained at this time. It is still available. I don't know if they're continuing to refresh the data. The nice thing about COAL is that it's easy to use. You can produce a lot of maps and tables. It doesn't take you very long, maybe 10 or 15 minutes of your time to figure out how it works. A lot of different carbon pools, again, pulling from that FIA database. You can pick counties in a state. You can pick multiple counties. You can pick a state. You can pick more than a state. And in the advanced user mode, which is still very easy to use, you can choose how you want your reports to set up. So if you wanted to look at everything in Connecticut and you wanted to have it classified by forest type group, you could very easily do that. There's also a version called GCOAL. They're very similar. So what can this do for you? Again, quick estimate, county, state level data. Again, you're getting your standard errors along with your estimate. And you can look, as I mentioned, forest types. You can stratify by age classes, ownership groups, a lot of things. The report will also give you the number of plots in that group, and that's an important thing to keep your eye on because, again, this is forest inventory and analysis data. So as you move to a smaller land area, you have fewer and fewer plots included and your errors will go up. So it's always important to pay attention to that when you're working with FIA data. You can't use this for stands. Again, one plot every 6,000 acres for FIA data. So this doesn't substitute for your detailed, if you're looking at a project and you want to do a project, it's not going to substitute for actual inventory data from your area. No fluxes, and there's no way to look at changes in management. So this is, you have your tables from the Green Book from GTR 343. This gives you similar, you can make maps. It does come from the FIA data, so it's going to be more recent than GTR 343, but a similar type of product. This tool is lesser known, the carbon calculation tool, and this was developed really to support Forest Service managers and to support our national reporting requirement. Probably not aware, we are signatories to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, and part of that responsibility is that you have to do an annual report of sources and sinks, so an annual greenhouse gas report. And a component of that, of course, is forestry, land use change, and forestry. So every year, the EPA has the responsibility, so the Forest Service works with the EPA to develop the forest portion of this, which is actually done now by the Forest Inventory and Analysis Program. So you can actually find these reports, and they give you a nice overview of forest carbon in the US every year. So a lot of these tools were developed to sort of support those reporting requirements. So the carbon calculation tool is a little bit larger. Instead of that stand or county, we're looking at state level output. And this starts in 1990. And so this does, again, work with FIA data. And you'll notice this is the mainland US. I mean, sometimes we say conterminous, which is a fancy way of saying the exact same thing. Alaska and Hawaii always kind of get the short end of the stick. And the reason for that is that there isn't any inventory in Hawaii. And Alaska, there is some inventory, but interior Alaska is very challenging. So it's densely forested. You actually have to drop the crews in there by helicopter, which is very expensive. And I've been told that one crew member's job is to stand there with a rifle and look for bears. So it's more expensive than your average inventory plot. So we are working on ways to work with remote sensing and minimize the inventory to get better data for Alaska. So that's why if you ever look at this and say, why are Alaska and Hawaii out of the picture, that's why. The nice thing about CCT is that you get these annualized estimates. Instead of looking at every 5 years or every 10 years, you can get it annual. And this one, actually, you can include some fluxes. The version available on the website was updated in 2017. And the person responsible for this is currently working on a 2018 update. So what can CCT do for you? Stock and flux estimates. So this is the first tool I've shown you that will give you those flux estimates if that's what's important to you. You do get those annualized estimates. You can, if you want, update it with current FIA data. There's also a contact on the website. You can contact Mike, and he can get you an updated version. And if you're interested in nationwide estimates, you can get them as well. And working with Mike, you might be able to get some other different flavors. But as it comes now, it's statewide estimate, which would be handy if you're interested and you want to look at the whole state of Connecticut and your stocks and fluxes for these pools. You can do that with CCT. It's pretty straightforward. Without modifications, you're looking at a state level. And you can't use your own data with this tool. This is designed specifically to work with FIA data. And also, there's no way to project scenarios. So again, you're just another way of taking data from the FIA database and turning it into information products that may be helpful to you. And that brings us to something that works completely differently, the Forest Vegetation Simulator, or FVS. Some of you may be familiar with FVS. This is actually a stand-level growth and yield model. It's an individual tree model. Uses field inventory data. Now, when growth and yield models use field inventory data, there's two basic ways they can work. Some models will just use volumes, volume by type, volume by stand, and project that. This is an individual tree model, so you do need to have, for each inventory plot, a list. You need diameter and species of those individual trees. The nice thing with FBS is you can simulate nearly any kind of management. Again, conterminous US, there is a variant for coastal Alaska, probably not relevant for most of you, but there is a little bit of Alaska in this tool. And while FBS is a growth and yield model, it can and does generate reports on forest carbon stocks, and this does include harvested wood products. So this is just showing you a little dialog box where you're requesting the reports, and then a little example of the table of output. So what can the carbon reports in FBS do for you? This is the first tool, because it is a growth and yield model, that will allow you to look at the carbon consequences of many management actions. You can simulate nearly anything in FBS. You can estimate, because it's a growth and yield model, you can project those carbon stocks over time with or without management, compare scenarios. You can use this at the stand and landscape scale. Some people have done, you can actually simulate an entire state or more if you are very patient and have a lot of computing power. What can't be done with FBS? This tool, unfortunately, you need detailed inventory data. It does have a lot of default values, but you do need species and diameter for every tree on the plot. There is no way around that because of the way the model works. You can actually download FIA data for your state and run it through a translator tool and use that in FBS, remembering, of course, the spatial scale that you can't substitute that at a stand level. And there's no soil carbon estimates in FBS. And the reason for that is that the soil carbon reported in the other tools, it's a combination of methods. It's some of the forest inventory and analysis data. There's some other ways that are used to generate those estimates. But we don't have very good information on how soils respond to management. Generally, changes, the research shows, are fairly slow in the absence of major disturbance, but soil carbon is very spatially variable and it responds differently in different circumstances. So we just don't have a confidence to add that in and feel that it is a number that is backed up by the research. So there is no soil carbon in the FBS reports. Some other tools that are out there, I mentioned before, there's a whole bunch of things on the FIA site. There's also, I'm going to put in a plug for iTree products. So many of you have probably heard of iTree. That's a whole suite of tools that has a lot to do with urban forests. And these tools range from very simple low data requirements to much more sophisticated tools that require inventory data. And you can look at greenhouse gas benefits using iTree from planting trees in specific places. iTree products gives you estimates of carbon and harvested wood products from harvest data. So this is very similar to the harvested wood products carbon report that comes out of the FBS system. It's also the same methods that produce the harvested wood product estimates that are in GTR 343, the Green Book. So those are all similar. And iTree Products has two modes. So if you have specific inventory data, you know how many board feet of hardwood and softwoods, how many cords, you can do that, or you can use a more general approach to kind of experiment and see how shifting the types of products you produce might affect carbon storage. So there are a lot of tools on the iTree site. There's also a whole lot of things out there on the web. Many of these are specific to a particular geographic region. Again, a tool is usually built in response to a need. So there are tools that are built, there's a lot of them for the Pacific Northwest that might just be for Oregon and not specific to any other place. We have some forest service tools that were built for national forests. So, you know, it's worth a look. You may find something you can modify, but just be aware that some tools are built for specific user groups. And there are a lot of carbon footprint calculators out there by all different sorts of nonprofits as well, and some economic tools. So, right tool for the right job. There's a lot of things to think about. Again, there are just so many tools out there produced by so many different groups. So the key thing for me is, what's that relevant spatial scale? If you're using, if you're talking about a project, you're looking at, you know, 300 acres of state forest, a tool that's meant to work statewide or national is not going to be appropriate. Do you need stocks or fluxes or both? That's really going to constrain you. A lot of the tools available are focused on stocks. What level of accuracy do you need? So some tools might be built on a specific area and they work very well for that. They might be designed to only give you a ballpark estimate. So it depends on what your needs are. Is this appropriate for your type and region? Again, I know there's some tools that have a lot of great functionality and they work in Oregon. You may be able to modify it for your circumstances, but just be aware that using a tool outside of the designated situation it was designed for is going to increase your error. Do you want to use your own data, and what kind of data do you have? If you only have volume data, that's going to constrain your tool selection. If you have those tree lists, then you have more options. Do you want to compare management scenarios? And then what carbon pools are of interest? Maybe you don't need them all. Some tools provide all the pools, some provide a subset. And how important is ease of use? FVS, the Forest Vegetation Simulator, it is very powerful. It has what's called geographic variance. So it's basically 22 different models giving you that nationwide coverage. So each variant is calibrated for that geographic area. But it does have a very steep learning curve. They do put on week-long training sessions because the model is so flexible and will do nearly anything. There's a lot to learn, and it's easy to get a simulation wrong. So, you know, how much time do you have to invest? How important is ease of use? That's another thing to think about when you're looking for tools. So I said we began with caveats and we would end with caveats. So here we are with more caveats, unfortunately. A tool, usually these are developed to meet a particular need. So 1605B, I mentioned that UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. There may be a state level program, and that tool might not be updated once that particular project or mandate expires. Certainly at a state level, administrations, when they change, they may have different priorities, and so something that there was a big focus on may no longer have that focus, and that support won't be there. So just be aware when you're shopping for a tool, is that tool still being supported and updated? How old are the data? Just something to pay attention to. Tools developed and supported by a particular researcher may not be updated or even maintained or available when that researcher retires and changes jobs. This is a situation with COAL. I don't know if COAL is still, it is available. I don't know if it is being actively updated at this point in time because the researcher who developed it is no longer with us. Support for a tool. This can be discontinued. It's easier to find money to build a tool than it is to maintain a tool. So that tool may be available but no longer maintained, or become, you know, no longer available if that funding source dries up. And again, I think I've said it 300 times by now, a tool developed for a geographic region or forest type. It doesn't mean you can't use it, doesn't mean I don't do coding. I've tried it, I don't have the patience for it. Some people love it. It doesn't mean you can't get the code from the model developer. If it's a non-commercial product, most people are very happy to share, and modify that code. If you like the way that product works, then modify it for your region and forest type. But generally, if it's developed for a particular area, it's not going to be portable without some work. So all the carbon tools that I've mentioned with the cans and can'ts, the Forest Service tools, can be found here on our Northern Research Station Carbon Tools page. And you don't have to remember the address. You can just Google Forest Service Carbon Tools and you should find it. The nice thing about this site is that there's a downloadable fact sheet for each of our tools that kind of gives you a little overview so you can, evaluate, is this tool for me? Is this going to help me? There should be a contact person for the tools as well. I did just check to see when things were updated, and we do periodically update that page and post new information. You can find all these tools and even more at the Climate Change Resource Center tools page. Also covers non-Forest Service tools as well, and a variety of calculators and things like that. You'll find a lot more things on this page that are particular to specific geographic locations rather than nationwide coverage. I think there's some guidance on that page as well for choosing tools. This is a screenshot of the Northern Station Carbon Tools page. So you can see there's a list of things. If you click on those, you'll get more information and the chance to download the fact sheet. I have a little red arrow there, kind of a big red arrow, that says literature resources for carbon inventories. Some of these are fairly old, but they're foundational, they're sort of basics. So if you're sort of interested in learning more about how to do this work and how it's used, I just like to point out that link because there's some publications to download there that could be very helpful to you. So final reminders, I've got a Swiss Army knife there. All tools have strengths and limitations. I see that this has a saw, obviously. If you were on a forest road somewhere and a giant tree had come down, you would not want to use that saw to clear the path. It's a limitation. All tools have strengths and limitations. It's important to know the design specs of the tool you're using. What were the assumptions? What was the data built on? What's the relevant spatial scale? Because you're going to have an increase in error levels once you get outside that limit. Doesn't mean you can't use it if you don't modify, if you modify it. But just know that when you start pushing the limits on intended use of a tool, you do bump up that error. One more time, spatial scale, very important when choosing the right tool for the right job. Always trade-off. So it's a matter of looking at what you need, looking at what you have, and figuring out, the best tool to meet your needs given the circumstances. There is just a cast of so many behind all these tools. This is just a list of some of the folks for the main tools that I talked about. A lot of these are developed in partnership with researchers and a lot of different institutions. And so it is definitely requires teamwork to build and maintain tools. And that is what I have. And I have my email up there. I'm also pretty easy to find, and certainly if you have any forest carbon questions at all, you should feel free to contact me. I hope this gave you a little bit of a taste of what's out there. So thank you.
Fabulous. That was really great. Thanks so much, Haley. I actually learned a ton, and it looks like we have quite a few questions have already come in, and if folks have questions top of mind, go ahead and send them in and I will read them aloud, but I'll go ahead and get started with the few that we have. So, so speaking of kind of your endpoint there, how has the accuracy in modeling improved over time?
So a lot of what's been improved, I would say, is improving is always tough when we're talking about estimations, because again, you have to have a lot of data to know how well you're doing. But in a lot of cases in the past, forest floor was modeled based on age. And so now that is done differently, that we have that forest health data, that phase 3 data. So the down dead wood was all modeled before, and now there is still a modeling component, but we have a lot more of that phase 3 data to inform that modeling and to go back and verify it. So those pools are definitely better. And I would say, you know, when we started doing this back in 2000, as the switch from the periodic FIA inventory, where they did the whole state at once and then came back 10 or 15 years later, now they measure a subset of plots every single year. So those data, which all of our tools sit on, are much more current and up to date now. And so that, that has made a big difference as well. When you're working with FBS, that is being constantly improved and updated as well. So that is always improving in its accuracy. But a lot of it is just the switch and having fresher data that are always available. And the biggest leap forward will come, there's a national biomass project underway right now. It's going to take years, but the equations you use to estimate how much biomass or carbon is in a tree, and volume as well, come from destructive sampling. And so people always argue about the best equations, and there are lots of different sets, but they're actually working on building a national set of biomass equations, you know, chopping down trees and drying them and weighing them and coming up with a consistent set. And that will be tremendously helpful, but that's years in the making.
Okay, great. And a follow-up to data collection, do you work, does the U.S. Forest Service work with private owners or land trusts to collect data? What is the relationship there?
So FIA data are actually collected across all ownerships. So there are plots on private land. That's why you can't get the exact plot coordinates to protect landowner privacy. So they are collected across all land ownerships. In terms of existing partnerships with land trusts and organizations, I don't have that information. I can say that as time moves on, the agency is more and more focused on working in partnership. We realize that no one entity can take care of everything that's needed to manage the resource alone. So there are definitely opportunities, I would say. You know, we're always interested in learning more about partnership. Brett Butler is the person who handles for the FIA program. He sort of does the family forest, small landowner part of it. And so, you know, he's available as well. And on that other tools page, you'll probably find some of that information through FIA. But I would say, you know, the door is always open to exploring partnerships.
Great, thank you. What are the limitations of FIA data to a small state like Connecticut, if any?
Well, you have, unfortunately, you know, one plot for every 6,000 acres. So you do have fewer plots in Connecticut, but I can tell you from having run statewide data, you got it a lot better than Rhode Island. They don't have very many plots at all. So again, it's always the thing. If you're looking at a county level, your errors are going to be higher. I don't know the average county size in Connecticut, but you just have fewer plots to work with. And that's always the case when you're in a smaller state, because that's a consistent. Now, that said, there are places where there is an intensified FIA grid where a state has requested it or a national forest and supplied funding. There might be particular areas of concern. You know, maybe it's a high value forest, or they're worried about a particular pest. And so agreements are made and that grid is intensified, and then you have more plots. That is always an option. That does tend to require additional funding. So, you know, it's a smaller state, so you do have fewer plots, but the quality of the data, you know, they're collected and cross-checked exactly the same way.
Great, thanks for the clarification there. Can you talk a little bit about the difference between carbon sequestered in trees versus soil?
Sure. Those are our two biggest pools, first of all, soil and live biomass, and it changes from north to south. So in the tropics, you have more carbon in trees than in the soil. As you move northward and head toward Canada, your larger pool is in the soil than the trees. Generally, soil carbon is very tricky because it's very spatially variable. We can make a hole, I've done this, and move 3 feet away and make another hole and get a really different number. So it's highly spatially variable, and it becomes hard to get, we're always going to have a pretty high error on those estimates for our smaller stands. Once you get up to a statewide level, that you're sort of outside the scale of variability, it's a little confusing. But generally, if anyone is interested, there's a really good meta-analysis by Luke Nave where he looked at all these different studies where they had done different harvest practices and silvicultural treatments and looked at soil carbon. Generally, in the absence of major ground disturbance, it doesn't change very much as far as we know from the current research. So the pool we can most influence and that changes the fastest is our above ground live tree carbon. The soils are generally a more stable pool.
Okay, great, thanks. So we have a very specific question. If I want to estimate how much a carbon forest can sequester and compare to a solar farm over 20 years, can one of the models do this?
Well, actually, there is a tool in progress right now. The forest part of it, I'm actually part of that team, and we're quite a ways from having that be ready. However, the tool is called Comet Farm, and you can find that pretty easily. And Comet Farm is exactly what it says. So, and I believe that's up and running and available. I don't know how many different management practices it allows you to compare, but it does give you through time. So for now, you could use Comet Farm for your farm part. It doesn't really have the forest functionality in it. And then you could use, say, GTR 343 for your forest estimate, unless you're an FES user. And then you could use FES. So hopefully the funding will be there to integrate the forestry portion into Comet Farm. But for now, I would use Comet Farm for your farm part, and then I would use GTR 343 to get an idea for the forest.
Okay, just a clarification. Comet, C-O-M-E-T, F-A-R-M, or
Comet-Farm.
Comet-Farm. Excellent. Great. Do any of the models allow stratification by site class?
So the existing tools, there's a little bit for some types that usually are plantations. In GTR 343 have some high productivity tables. When you use, if you're using FBS, you can adjust nearly anything in FBS. That's why it has such a high learning curve. So you could actually adjust your site index in that model. When it comes to the FIA tools, you can actually request tables by productivity class. So there are ranges of cubic feet per acre per year. I don't know how those productivity classes are assigned, so I don't know how reliable they are, but you can go ahead and break those reports out by those site productivity classes.
Okay. Do any tools take into account methane fluxes in forested wetlands?
That is a great question. No, they do not, and that is, wetlands are really, really tricky. The person who does the most work with that, I don't know that there are any tools. If you wanted to talk about forested wetlands, I would refer you to Carl with a C Trettin, Trettin. He's with the Forest Service, and he is our forested wetlands guy. There is, I'll have to send a link to it. There is another book, a USDA document that came out in July 2014. I will send the link to that. It covers all sectors, and it does actually have, so it's called Quantifying Greenhouse Gas Fluxes in Agriculture and Forestry, Methods for Entity Scale Inventory. And this is what Comet Farm is based on. There is a chapter on forested wetlands in here that would have some guidance about how to estimate. And I will get that link to you. But that is a very tricky situation because it depends so much on water levels.
Okay.
I'm sorry I can't be more helpful on that, but Carl Trettin is definitely he is our forested wetlands expert.
Okay, great. That's helpful. A couple more questions. So the IT products, can you talk a little bit more about, is this used to estimate how carbon sequestration potential is lost through tree harvesting or forest clearing? Who typically uses these tools?
Okay, so the users range, it's a pretty broad range. Most often we'll see landowners or organizations who are interested in having, some idea, like how much carbon might be in my stand. That's a really common use. GTR 343 in some programs is used as a baseline, as a common practice baseline. And again, a lot of these are developed for reporting. So we've actually had states use them too. If you don't want to derive your own, it's going back to the FIA estimate. Again, it wouldn't break out state land specifically. It would be the forest resources for the entire state of Connecticut if you were using CCT. So a lot of reporting uses and planning. The only tool I presented that allows you to do simulation would be FBS. So you could, if you wanted to say, oh, if we're going to clear, I'm just going to make something up. We're going to clear 50 acres to put in a solar array. I don't know how many acres a solar array would be. So then you could use any of these tools to come up with an average for that. Let's say it's beech birch maple. What's the average mature beech birch maple stock? So you could use any of these tools to come up with that, coal or GTR 343. And then you could say, okay, we're gonna, we're gonna take this and we're gonna remove this when we clear cut for the solar array. We're not growing trees back. You could use one of the harvested wood products tools to figure out the storage and harvested wood products. So in that sense, you could use some of these more static tools if you were looking at permanent conversion. If you want to look at changes in management practice, like improved forest management, maybe pre-commercial thinning, then FBS would be the tool that would allow you to do that because it has that simulation component.
Okay. One last question, unless folks have any burning questions, submit them now. So one question, maybe some clarification around, estimating carbon in, one moment in time, or do these tools project forward, or both?
Well, that's the cans and can'ts. That's where that comes in. So GTR 343 you could say has sort of a forward projection. These were, based on data, and it gives you stocks from year 0 to either 85 or 125 years or so, depending on the forest type. So it gives you volume and carbon stock for those regional averages through time. You can't change anything, it's just a lookup table. CCT goes from 1990 to the last year of update and will give you fluxes as well, but it can't project. FVS is stocks and it can project. Coal is stocks only, and that's just the point in time. Of course, if you wanted the difference, you could go and retrieve older data, but that would be challenging because most of these tools, when the data is refreshed, the prior years aren't maintained. The FIA database as well, when states have had remeasurement, you could get change from that as well through the data mart. So it depends on the tool as to whether it's a stock or a flux or both. And then only FVS lets you truly project into the future, but you can get a ballpark from GTR 343.
Great, thanks for the clarification there. Okay, well, so that's all the questions that came in, and we're right near the 1 o'clock hour. So I just want to thank you so much. That was extremely informative, and we had a great turnout with lots of really excellent questions. So thank you again, Chaley, for your time and expertise and sharing it with us.
And thank you for the opportunity to share a little bit of Carbon Tools with you today.
So folks, we will have this recording on our website under the Climate Solutions webinar series portion of the climate change website. Chaley has also will provide us with a PDF of her presentation. So if there was some slides that maybe moved too quickly, you can go ahead and download that. She's left her contact information, so if you have follow-up questions, feel free to follow up. We have not scheduled our next webinar, but stay tuned. We will send out an announcement once we have that scheduled. I always encourage our listeners to send us ideas of topics that you'd like to hear about. So just go ahead and send that to the climate change email address. Thanks, everyone. Have a great afternoon. And thanks again to our presenter. Have a great day.